So this is gonna be the video on how to manipulate a background when it comes to marker, guys. Just a reminder that you can use, it's preferable to use the washable Crayola kind just because you can manipulate it easier. But if all you have is Sharpie, it'll work and you'll see some effects on it. And I'm gonna be playing and manipulating at this point. If you guys, I didn't mention this, but for those of you guys that have acrylic, and what I mean by acrylic, like they sell this apple barrel paint. So if you have like this kind of acrylic, this is white, so it doesn't make sense to use white. Like it would have to be like if you have the blue or the reds or the yellows or other colors in this kind of acrylic. Technically, what you can do for this, if this is all you've got, if you water this down, like I did the watercolor, where I made a little puddle and I added a little bit of color and manipulate it, you can still do the same effect that I did with the watercolor with apple barrel acrylic paint. Any acrylic paint, as you know, that you got will work, okay? So if you have that, you can still follow the watercolor video, but like I said, with the intention of using a lot of water with it. So you're gonna water it down a lot. So if that's something that you do have, you can follow the watercolor video with that, but this is gonna be how to do it with a marker, okay? So at this point, we're gonna play with this. There are different ways of going about this. So you can either choose, and just be aware, kind of like what I talked about with the watercolor, that you can get too dark, and when you manipulate with the water, it will dilute, and you can, move it around and get some different kinds of styles and so forth. You can even do pointillism for those of you guys that really like the pointillism and you want to do pointillism on the whole thing. It's going to take a long time, but it is possible. But if you actually just go and we start just applying the marker, like let's say I know I want this color somewhere right here. So we're going to do two different ways, which you'll see. This way that I'm doing right now, where I'm just applying the color where I want it, so it's a little bit faster, will not damage the marker. All it is it's of course just using the ink that's inside. So let's just say, okay, well, I want to give it some kind of texture. So I'm going to put this color right here, and then I'm going to go ahead and get the light green and put some light green right here. And just kind of manipulate the colors. Don't color them all in one spot. So I'm just going and adding my colors. So there's two different methods, like I said, and I'm doing it with the copy paper first just to show you, but you can do it with this good paper as well. I'm going to scoot that over to the side so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better on camera. So I'm going to add this color here. I do recommend to stick to the light colors as you're doing this, just because of the fact being that if it stays light, then you're not going to have any problems with being able to draw on this later. So you'll just go and add colors kind of like where you want it, kind of like what we did with the watercolor. So we're going to play with this. I'm not going to do the whole thing because I'm going to show you how to do it different on the opposite way, okay? And then maybe I can put some like right here. So after this, have you guys ever at this point, if you've ever gotten this kind of marker wet, you know that it's going to bleed. Now, I do recommend to put paper towels on the bottom of this because just like we did with the watercolor, we're going to get our surface dirty. So I'm going to go ahead and just put my newspaper down on the bottom just in case. And then just for the sake of having this on video, I'm also going to do some with Sharpies. So this is like a silver. We'll do the same technique at least on a little bit here, but where I have these colors is going to be where I have the Sharpies available. And I just wanted you guys to see, look at how dark this color is. I wouldn't pick this color, but it's all I've got to kind of practice with the Sharpies. So you can see how it's going to be a little bit more difficult for Sharpies, especially when it comes to just applying water to it. So if you've ever worked with marker before and you've ever gotten it wet, you'll know that you can manipulate it. And if you're not careful, you can damage your piece. So I'm going to go ahead and pour some in my cup because I have it in a bottle at this point. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab a brush just so we can first manipulate. If you don't have a brush, you can get away with just slowly, not a lot. If you have Q-tips, you can also do that for manipulation. But if you notice, as I get it wet, it's already manipulating and getting, it's going to start moving the paint. So if you have a brush, you can actually move and manipulate that water to play around a little bit more with the marker. Now, the longer it sits on the marker, the more it removes. So I'm gonna have to let it sit for a little while. This is why I'm telling you guys, if you have a brush, you can almost kind of like scratch the surface. Now, I don't want to scratch too much either because I don't want my paper to rip. But if I just let it sit slowly, so let's say I let it sit in this area, you're gonna notice the watermarks around that on the side of the actual marker. Because if you've ever gotten a project wet with marker, you're gonna notice that, oh man, I got it wet, and you try cleaning it and you see the mess up. So we're gonna let this sit a little bit so that way the colors bleed into each other. So I'm gonna leave that alone. And honestly, like with this kind of style, this is all you have, you don't have watercolor. This is why I tell you guys stick to the light colors so that way it doesn't necessarily get too dark and you'll still be able to draw on top of it. If dark colors is all you have, well then that's all you have. But you're gonna have to, and I will show you, of course, at the very end, how to manipulate. Now, if you have a paper towel, you can pick up some of that marker. So if it got too dark in certain areas, instead of a brush, you can use one of these. And I can even use this. So like, let's say I have this color, and if you want to just kind of play around with it, like I was showing you on some of the other stuff, you can make little, areas where you're kind of doing that with the brush. So you can do that too. Now I want to show you that with Sharpie, it's a little different because it's permanent marker. So it will bleed in time, but you're gonna have to let the water sit on it a lot longer than you would the washable markers, okay? So I'll leave it right here just so you can kind of see the effects. You can already see how this is changing. This is why with marker, if you're gonna do this, you need to make sure that you add the colors where you're gonna want that particular color to look like. But it does look different compared to watercolor. I just know that some people don't have the materials. So if you don't have the materials, then you're gonna end up doing it something more like this. And if you do want it full of color, like you notice right here, there's not a lot of color. This is the color of the paper. That's because when I originally put the marker, I had this kind of little zigzag. So if you like that look, then don't completely fill it. And if you don't like that look, then what you're gonna wanna do is you wanna make sure that you completely fill it with that color 100%, so you don't get those little white effects in between, okay? So just be aware, look how I left the water here and it starts to spread and make more texture. So these are things that you need to understand, that the way you add the water will affect the watercolor in general. So if I just want little dots, you know, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna just do this with my brush because I have my brush. You can get different effects in different spots. So let's just say I know I'm going to draw my fish right here when it comes to the watercolor technique. If I know my fish is going to be here and I like the way this looks with the marker, and I don't necessarily want to have that whole entire watercolor look on the whole thing, then I'm going to leave it alone and I'm only going to get this part wet because I know this is where I'm going to apply my drawing and I like this part of the background, okay? Now, at this point, the Sharpie is not moving as much, and that's okay, just because of the fact being that when you have Sharpie, because it's permanent, it's probably gonna have to sit. So you're gonna have to continuously get it wet and keep it wet for like a good, I don't know, I think the last time I would try this particular technique with Sharpie, it took maybe about 30 minutes before I actually started seeing the stuff move. So I had to continuously make sure that it was wet and it wasn't dry. But if you also pick up some of the pigment as it's wet, you can kind of force it, but it will take a long time. So I have to keep applying the water and then remove, applying the water and then remove, but because it is permanent, so it's more difficult to manipulate. Now, if you don't want to have to worry about taking so long, if you have Sharpies, this is why I told you guys that if you guys have rubbing alcohol, which is the one that you use to clean like cuts and so forth, or hydrogen peroxide will also work. The thing is a hydrogen peroxide, for those of you guys that have ever cleaned a cut, it has a smell to it. So if you don't care about the smell, you can use those to get this for a Sharpie look, okay? So if all you have is Sharpie and you don't want to be waiting so long for it to get manipulated, like I said, make sure that you get the rubbing alcohol to be able to get some of these little effects over here. So this is just one technique on using this. The other technique that you can do is kind of like what we did with the watercolor. This is just a little bit easier to control when it comes to marker. But the other technique that you can do for using marker would be to get the water on the paper first. So I'm going to first wet my paper. So I'm dropping a little bit of water here with the intention of moving it, of course, with my brush. So let's just say I apply, and it's kind of puddled. Like if you notice my movement on this, it's a good amount of water that's sitting on this. So what I'll do is now, if you do it like this, be aware that you will mess up your markers if you do it like this, but you can get your marker and then touch the water, and you can see that I'm dropping it like watercolor. So if you want watercolor effect with marker, you can go ahead and do it like this to where you're touching the area. But look how my marker looks. So it does damage the marker if you do it like this. So just be aware, because when you come over here and you do it, it'll still work, but look at how light it is because I damaged that part of the marker. So if you're willing to ruin your markers, you can do this. Same technique as what we were doing with the original watercolor, but it's because I'm applying a lot of water first to manipulate, okay? So I'm gonna actually damage that marker, and I'm also gonna damage this marker because I want this color too. So I'm gonna go ahead and put a little bit of this pink. Now, if you touch the paper, you're gonna get marks on it. So if you don't want to be very, see how this part is wet, but not with puddle, I can manipulate the marker on it and get it a little bit darker if I wish. So I'm gonna push this water over here to get my paper wet. See, I can kind of manipulate the color too. And since this part, like if I were to just get, for instance, so if I'm gonna get a little bit of the tissue paper, I'm gonna just soak up a little bit of that water so it's not full water on there. And then this part is not puddled, but the paper's wet. So if I go and I touch it, I can make it a little bit lighter toned. And you can see that here. So it's a lighter tone of that marker. And see how when I come here, you see how it looks white on the marker? So you will damage the marker the more you touch it. So just FYI, but you can still get that watercolor look if you are doing it with the water first and then applying the marker on top of it, okay? So at this point, I know I've had people before, I don't recommend doing this, but I have had people before where they'll take their markers and they kind of do this little splat thing and they'll go like that. And you can see it, but again, that's not really controlled. When you're doing it like this, it's a little bit more controlled, but for markers, it's a harder way of getting it. Like I see little tiny splats for doing that. So I've had people go like this before, but like I said, they have to go so hard. So be very careful if you're going to try to get that look with the marker, just because of the fact being that you're going to, if you're like in your mom's kitchen, you're probably going to get something dirty. So don't make her upset if you're going to be doing that kind of look. Okay. I would prefer that, like I said, that you get watercolor, because with the watercolor, it's a little bit easier because you're just going like this rather than making a mess all with marker. Okay. So just FYI, I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware that just because you don't have watercolor doesn't mean you can't get these kind of effects with it. So if you don't want to damage the marker, this is the way to go. You know, if you want to be able to use your markers later, is to apply the color first in the areas that you want it. Then you go and get it wet. If you want more of the watercolor look, and I still have a lot of water that's on here. So, you know, it's just going back and kind of dabbing with a towel. If you know, like a little napkin or something, if you know that that's as much as you're going to want in that particular area. Okay. So I'm just going to go and just dab it. Now it's still a little wet. So if I want to go back, since I already damaged those markers, if I just want to go back and add some more of that color, because it's like, no, I want more of this light blue, because my paper is still wet. So I'm going to go in so I can show you. Because the paper is still wet on those spots. And if, again, especially if you have a brush, you can kind of manipulate the edges like this. So that way it doesn't look like a harsh marker applying to the edge, and it'll still have that watercolor look to it, okay? So you guys have the choice of what you're gonna do for the ending, as far as like what you're gonna do for your final, for that background look. Again, like something like this, I would let it sit, and honestly, I would put more texture on this. But once it's dry, just to take it and apply a couple of dots. and that'll even further have more spread within there. I just have to wait a little bit because it was already kind of drying. So at this point, if I re-wet it, I'll have more little splats and spots. And that's how you just get texture on this. But wait till it dries and then you do it again where you just apply water on it and you'll have more of those little, kind of like this effect. If I'm going to show you from, because I do have an example here. So let me just get it real quick so that way I show you the right one. But we're on one of the examples that I showed you guys yesterday, this one. If you wait for this to dry and then you just put water only, you'll get it to look like this. So if you want more texture, because it's not enough texture, you just have to be patient, wait, and apply water only, and then you'll have more little areas that have like this kind of little bleed effect. And you can still do this with the watercolor too. This is actually watercolor. This is not marker, the one that you're seeing here, but you can get those same effects if you're applying it in that specific way, okay? Now, if you did watercolor and you want this effect, it's the same thing. Now that it's dry, just take water only, and then you take the brush and you do the little tap, 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 and then this will happen. So you'll get little areas that are a little bit lighter than others. This, for me, looks a lot better when it comes to texture-wise, guys. So this looks better than something like this. For me, this looks too flat. So if I compare this to this, the more texture you have, the better the finished product is going to be. So if you have little splats and stuff like that, it's just going to look that much better, okay? Now, like I said, if you have a thicker paper, like listen to it, you can kind of hear that it has a thickness to it. If you do this to this, then it'll look better. It's a little bit more controlled. But if all you have is copy paper, you can still do that because that's what this is. And I'm still able to get those particular effects, okay? This is not finished up here unless, of course, you like that look, the contrast between just marker and water. But be aware that you do need enough space of this to be able to draw on your final. So if you're liking this look, like you like that whole water bleeding area where it goes into the marker, then just make sure, like on this one, like if I get close up, you can see that there are some little textures of just the water by itself right here. However, you know, don't do too much of that because you're going to need the surface for the drawing. So you need some areas that look a little bit more diluted like this, okay? So at this point, I am going to stop the video just because I want to make sure that I get questions from the people that are here. So let me go ahead and stop it.